spend some time looking at the work of Tintoretto. Hopefully by the time you leave today, you'll have a better appreciation of who he really was and of the type of work that was being produced in Venice in the 16th century and why he's so important in terms of art history and his association with other artists that followed him afterwards. Okay. So, my talk will have two parts to it. The first part is a brief introduction, and the introduction will cover what we know about him, some facts that we know about Tintoretto. Now, Marie's already alluded to some of that information, but I'll try to go into a bit more detail. We'll talk about mannerism. Now, mannerism was a style which was popular around this time, which evolved in between 1520 and 1600. It was a style of painting. And so we need to cover that in order to sort of understand his work and understand the context of his work. And three, I'll finish the introduction off with a brief summary just to consolidate that learning for you and so that you've got a better idea of what we're talking about as we proceed. Okay, so here's the man. We've seen this picture before. Also known as Jacopo Robusti, also known as Tintoretto. And we've got his dates for his life there. You can see he actually lived quite a long time. When you consider especially the time when people would die during that period, it was common for people to die of the plague or illness or accident well before their 70th birthday. The average lifespan I was reading was about 35 to 40 years. So to be able to live to 70 was a pretty good effort. And so the next thing we look at is, so what do we know about it? What do we know about Tintoretto? Now, he's an enigmatic character. He's a strange type of person. We know a lot about his work. We see a lot of it. Venice is full of it, and you'll see what he does. But there are things about him personally which we can only infer through other people, through what other people have said about him. Here are some facts. His father was a Tintoretto, or a dyer. So, as Maria pointed out, Venice was a centre of commerce. There was a big trade in imports of fabrics and dyes from the east. The dyers' trade became well established in Venice during the preceding centuries, from about the 12th century onwards, and it's still alive and well today. It's a traditional trade that many people still follow in Venice. Okay, he was present in the workshop of Titian. We don't know how long for though. People usually refer to Titian as his teacher, but it's really not certain how long Tintoretto actually hung around in his studio. Okay, because he got kicked out. He was a bit of a troublemaker. He had a pretty strong character. There were other apprentices who complained about him. So he was, sort of a funny type of character that people didn't like. A bit like me, I think. So because of his constant representation and others, he was asked to leave, or he just nicked off. He just left. Okay, but we know that around 1539, he opened his own bottega. Now, the bottega was a shop, a workshop. And openly competed against his old teacher for lucrative commissions. Now, this was a bone of contention with Titian. Because Tintoretto was such a highly skilled and bright person, and Titian knew that. That's why they probably used to clash a lot. Because he knew all those sort of things, his teacher was very wary of him and did everything to block commissions to his young ex-students, if you want to call him that. So the early part of Tintoretto's career was marred by this competition with his old teacher. So he opened his own studio. He later employed his sons Domenico and Marco, as well as his daughter Marietta, as studio assistants. We know that already. We've heard Maria speak about that. So Boris Titian has become known as a preeminent Venetian painter, an exemplar of the High Renaissance style. Okay, in the first half of the 16th century in Venice, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment. Tintoretto is considered the major Venetian painter of the second half of the century and a major exponent of what was called mannerism. Okay, mannerism, remember, is a style that evolved. Okay. So, what is mannerism? Okay, the term was first coined by this gentleman called Luigi Lanzi in the first part of the 18th century to describe the style of art produced between 1520 and 1600. Now, Luigi Lanzi is an interesting character. If you do a bit of reading about him, he was an archaeologist, an amateur archaeologist, historian, art lover, and he set about the idea of studying art and sort of beginning to codify it. Now, when you look at art history, it's very common to think of art history as having definite periods, and everybody's always known them to be these art periods. But really, it's a modern construct. art history and art history theory and education has sort of imposed this artificial timeline on art between definite dates, but it never actually happened like that in reality. Dates overlap, artists overlap, they influence each other in funny ways, but to sort of understand periods, we try to simplify them. And so he came up with a set of precepts which define mannerism. Okay, some of the main exponents of mannerism in painting were Andrea Daniel, also known as Andrea del Sarto. He was a Florentine. Now I'm going to introduce you to some names here. We'll see what they all got in common. I go for Jacopo Carucci, aka Pontormo. Giovanni Battista di Jacopo, also known as Rosso Fiorentino, or the Red Florentine, and he's the author of that particular painting in the Mannerist style. We'll talk about it in a moment from that. And Girolamo Francesco Maria Mazzola, also known as Parmigianino, because he came from Parma. He probably liked his share of cheese as well. So, Parmigianino. Domenico Theotokopoulos, who's Greek around here? One Greek at the back, the artist. Okay. El Greco. El Greco is a famous artist, and he's really important because through El Greco, we start to see mannerism and the work of Tintoretto pass into Spain. And that's another major road which we won't travel down because it's very long, but we'll just touch on later on. And then we have Michelangelo Merisi, not to be confused with Michelangelo Buonarroti, who's the author of the Sistine Chapel and the David and all that. Michelangelo Merisi is also known as Caravaggio. And who's heard of Caravaggio? Very famous artist, amazing artist. We'll be dealing with him in a lecture down the road. And Paolo Cagliari, also known as Veronese, and he came from Verona. Now, Veronese was a contemporary of Titian, and he ended up being one of his main competitors. You've got to imagine Venice at the time was populated by these different schools, different art studios, let's call them like that. And they're all competing against each other for work. And they would compete for work to decorate chapels, churches, private residences, etc. And so that sort of explains in a way, and it's a very small city. You've got to think the population, it's a small city, a lot of artists and a lot of top artists that were really highly skilled. And not just in Venice, but all the way through the Italian peninsula, all as far as in Sicily, this sort of happened. But in the northern part of Italy it was particularly strong. And these people were, you learned from your teacher directly. You lived with your teacher, you started off as a young, maybe 7, 8 or 9, doing menial tasks in the studio, cleaning brushes, learning to mix paint, assisting other apprentices, and eventually you became senior enough to assist the master in the production of their work, and then eventually when you got good enough and mature enough, you probably took off and opened your own shop. And so these people were highly trained people. Okay, so it's a different environment to what we live in today. Today we teach art, so-called, in schools, and so what you learn in art in schools and in colleges is very different to the experience of the artist of that time. It was actually a major occupation that the city actually needed, because it needed artists to paint scenes of the Bible to teach people who were not literate. And so the use of images in teaching became a major thing. Okay, so what are the characteristics of mannerism? Now here we have a painting by the aforementioned El Greco. El Greco was really a top exponent of mannerism, and the reason why I put it there is because he had a close association with Titian. It seems as though they both studied for a short period in Titian's workshop. So Tintoretto and El Greco came across in contact with each other through Titian's workshop, and he took off in his direction and Tintoretto did his stuff. Really interesting. Okay, so what is mannerism? It's the reaction against the ordered, idealised standards of the High Renaissance. Now, who knows Leonardo? Yes? Michelangelo, Raphael. They're the three artists that dominate the High Renaissance in Italy. And by the time the High Renaissance came, around about between 1510 and 1520, you started to have people wanting sort of standardised beauty. So there was a standard for beauty. Everything that we know about what is beautiful, symmetry, proportion, all those things were codified in the High Renaissance, and so you had work which reflected this. And it reflected a certain world order. Remember, the church was very powerful, it had very definite beliefs, and the artwork reflected those beliefs about a perfect world made by a perfect God who was harking back to the theories and philosophy of Plato and Aristotle about the universe and how everything operated so perfectly and how the universe revolved around the earth. So this was a really fundamental thing that was, before Martin Luther came along, was not ever challenged. And so society was very stable because it had a very stable structure to work within. Okay, it's a transitional style, a style that bridges basically the High Renaissance to what later became known as the Baroque period. Now the Baroque period, I don't know if you're familiar with Baroque art, it's very ornate, it's very out there, it's full of spirals and swirls, it's fantastic, it's really beautiful work. But this work is a transitional period work. It's work which starts to break away from that ordered sort of structure of the High Renaissance. It's like a rebellion against it almost. Okay? It's a very personal stylistic approach. Mannerist artists were very different to each other. That's not necessarily true of the minor artists of the High Renaissance, because once you standardise beauty, you have a lot of people reproducing the same thing over and over again in a different way, you know, highly skilled technically, no doubt, but there's no individual personality coming out there. Mannerist artists were different. Because they were very individualistic, they projected this in their work. So it's very personal stylistic approach that emphasises individual maniera, that's where the word mannerism comes from, vision or technique of the artist. So each one had their own take on things and they weren't afraid to show that. Okay, and the colours are often exaggerated or heightened for dramatic effect, and you can certainly see that in the sample there. This could be a 20th century painting, if you look at it. It's very expressive, it's very bright, it's colourful, it's abstract, and it's very ambiguous in various ways, in the same way that a lot of modern paintings are. The human figure is often distorted, okay, or stylised to convey emotion or treated in a natural, non-idealised manner. Remember, they were not aiming necessarily for an ideal form. They were aiming to be expressive of something else, something beyond the physical, the way things look. And this thing was more like a spiritual thing, okay? And they also incorporated exaggerated perspective, ambiguous spatial relationships. So, you know, in High Renaissance work, everything was worked out according to mathematical principles and laws. The art of perspective itself was developed during the Renaissance, and it's said that you could actually, you know, in the very early Renaissance paintings of Mantegna and people like Sanciolo, you could actually determine how deep the room was by the formula that they used in their paintings. So you could actually work that out, right? In the Mannerist period, however, perspective is used in a symbolic way. And people take liberties with perspective. They start to push the rules a bit. And we'll see that in Tintoretto's work. Okay, so basically it's highly charged emotional work. It appeals to the heart rather than the head in many ways, even though there's a lot of thinking behind it, obviously. Okay, so this is the summary. Okay, here we've got two paintings. We've got a painting by Raphael, painted in 1506, and then we've got a painting of one of the very earliest Mannerist paintings. They're the same subject. Okay, they're both Madonnas. One is High Renaissance, one is early Mannerist. This is not Tintoretto, by the way. This is Giannino. Okay, but I chose that because you can start to see the differences. Okay, what do you notice about this figure here? How would you describe it? How would you describe this figure? Look at her. Look how she's sitting. Look at the composition.
It's full and it's sort of slightly off focus.
Yeah, soft, yeah.
Soft focus, yeah. And sort of they're full figure, sort of cherubic and soft.
Yeah, they're calm, aren't they? The painting is a calm painting. Yeah. It's very rational.
Realistic.
There's a lot of realism there's an attempt to convey things as they appear, truly. When you look at the landscape, there's a definite foreground, middle ground, and background. The artist has even gone to the trouble of looking at aerial perspective, you know, just how things tend to change with distance. So we know that when you look at it, I don't know if you've noticed, if you look at a picture of a mountain range, the mountains very far away appear to be a bluish hue or a violet hue. Okay, and that's because of the way colour works through the atmosphere at a distance. And so, sorry. Look at the mountains there. You know, everything is very calm and ideal. It's an idyllic landscape with an idyllic Madonna, with idyllic cherubim like kids. Okay, it's beautiful. It's harmony. Okay, there's nothing. It's classical. Okay, it's a classical image. Let's look at the Parmigianino now. What do you notice about? Just compare the figure first. What do you notice about this figure as compared to this figure? How would you describe it? You look at the name of the painting itself, that'll tell you something. Mind you, he never called that became known as the Madonna with a long neck afterwards, okay, because artists didn't know how to describe this painting. But it's exaggerated, it's stylized, it's stretched, the figure's stretched. And it's a very individualistic way to look at the figure. Yeah? Very, very different to this. Now, Raphael was high Renaissance. He was the god of the Renaissance. In many ways, even though he was an amazing, amazing genius, the people who came after him they were stunted by the fact that he'd reached such perfection and they were copying him. They weren't copying nature anymore. And so, by the time this art starts to pop up, you start to feel some disquiet. And it's not a coincidence purely that this happened during the Reformation. Now imagine what's happening in the background. Maria already explained a bit about that. It was this huge religious conflict. You know, suddenly we got the Orthodox Catholic Church that's suddenly being challenged. And what the reverberation throughout society has an impact on people. People started to think, well, why should I stick to what other people tell me to do? Who says that beauty is like this? Who says that this is necessarily true? And artists started to question this, and they started to express this individually through their work. Very interesting when you look at these things in this way. Look at the space, before we move on to the next slide, look at the space here. You can tell that there's distance here.
Yeah.
That's the front, you can see detail, middle ground, background, back here things are smaller. But look at this background. There's foreground, background, no middle ground. So the effect of that is that this figure is towering above you, almost bursting out of the frame. Right? That's an amazing thing. It's to us with our vision today, because we've got cameras, we don't quite see it. But this was revolutionary in its own time. It was shocking. Some people liked it, most people didn't, because they couldn't quite grasp and understand what artists were trying to do. The other thing is, the last thing I'll talk about is, in high Renaissance art, there's an emphasis on trying to subdue colour to the form. In other words, the purpose of colour on a painting is to help describe the 3D aspect of a shape or a form. Yeah? As a result, you want to keep your brushwork as smooth as you can to emphasise the form. By the time the Romanesque period starts, artists start to break this rule, and they start to apply colour as a means to express something else other than what the painting is about. Yeah? And you start to see texture, and you start to see the brushwork being left. And Tintoretto was fantastic with that, and you'll see that in a moment. Okay. That's sort of clear what's happening there? Yeah? So I'll move on quickly. Okay. Il disegno di Michelangelo e il colorito di Tiziano, the drawing of Michelangelo and the colour of Titian. Okay, so moving to the second part of the talk. Okay? Obviously, one of his main influences was Titian, his teacher. Again, he wasn't in his studio for that long. And they did argue, and he did get kicked out. But there's like a begrudging respect for his old teacher. That he would, but this can also be seen, that saying there, okay, the drawing of Michelangelo and the colour of Titian, can also be seen as a challenge to his teacher. So some people say it's like he's paying homage, right, to Titian, because Titian's style was extremely popular in Venice. That he was extremely wealthy and powerful, okay, and he was very well known. His style was very even the fame of Titian even reached as far as Rome. And it's said that Vasari, the art historian Vasari, who was lived at the same time as Tintoretto, is said to have introduced Titian to Michelangelo, Titian's work to Michelangelo, and apparently Michelangelo looked at it and he said, "It's not bad, this work." You go, these Venetians, they're learning to paint. Pity they can't draw as well. All right? That's apparently what he said. Okay, so you can see that even someone like Michelangelo knew Titian. But this is a challenge. So what does Tintoretto try to do? From the very beginning, he tries to create what's called the purple cow. I learned that from Marvin Oka. Okay, he tries to create a point of difference. What's he going to do that's going to outshine Titian in this really competitive environment? And he wants to, remember, he's there for blood. He wants to take over the whole art industry. This is how ambitious Tintoretto is, and he has to knock down or supersede his teacher at the same time. And at the same time, Titian is aware of this, and he's doing his best to block any commissions to come to him. It's a really dramatic story that's happening in the background of all this. So I'm having to rush it because we want to get through the work, but it's really interesting anyway. Okay, so he's a dominant painter of the Venetian Renaissance. His work was primarily admired for its idealised figures. So if you look at a Titian, it's closer to a Raphael. It's like a Venetian version of Raphael. The figures are all beautiful. They're beautifully proportioned. There's a harmony in the painting. The paint is applied in a very smooth, perfect, polished way. Okay, and it's very clear. His compositions are very balanced and clear. Okay. And so in Titian's workshop, okay, it produced several different types of work. You'll see that he would do large altarpieces that appear in churches. These paintings are fairly large. They appear in churches. They'll also be involved in doing portraits. These are all Titian's works. Lots and lots of portrait work as business, as a job would come through the shop, and the students would work on it, and the teacher would work on it. And then you'd also have these sort of things. Now, this is not a Christian image, is it? No, it's a mythological scene from ancient Greek and Roman myth, and this is another main subject that artists dealt with during this period. So it wasn't just all Christian iconography, etc. Remember that the Renaissance was in part founded on this interest in ancient knowledge and ancient things, and part of that was Greek and Roman myths and Greek and Roman gods and things of that nature. They became very fashionable, and these things would usually grace the private apartments of the Doge or some rich merchant or something of that nature. Okay, so he would have learned valuable lessons about how this work is produced, etc., that he later carried on himself. Okay, the other influence, of course, is Michelangelo Buonarroti. Okay, he was a sculptor, a painter, an architect, and a poet. Very few people realise he was a poet, but he did some beautiful sonnets on beauty and things. Very interesting character. Probably one of the most famous artists that's ever lived. Even if you don't like art, you hear about him. He's one of those people, like Picasso, for instance, that you know. Even though you don't know anything about art, you know Picasso. You've heard of it, you know who he is. Okay? He was famous because he reinterpreted the human forms from ancient Greek models. Yeah? So his heroic reinterpretations of the human body and architecture, remember he's an architect as well, derived from classical Greece and Rome, had a major impact on the art of the early and high Renaissance and subsequent art movements like the Baroque. So he lived a very long time, 1475 to 1564. We're well into the Mannerist period, about to come into the Baroque. And so having lived so long and having had so much influence, he was really a man to follow, to look at. And his fame reached Venice. Now, Tintoretto, as Maria stated earlier, it's not sure that he actually travelled anywhere. He stayed in Venice most of his time. Some writers say that he did travel once to Rome, but that's not even certain. We know that he came in contact with Michelangelo's work, basically through copies that were made by other artists. The prints, that we heard about earlier, printmaking, prints of imagery that was sent up, and also casts of statues that were reproduced and that he collected. So he would draw from these, and you'd know what's going on in Rome, what Michelangelo's doing in Rome. Amazing stuff. These days we Google it, we find out. Yeah, but back then you had to get a whole cast and take it with you. Okay. Interesting. And this is the type of thing that Michelangelo was doing. Now this is in Florence. This is the part of the Medici tombs. Amazing work. Okay, then you've got the figures of the symbolic allegorical figures of night and day. Okay, we've got the statue here representing Giulio de' Medici. This just as a matter of interest, this figure became the inspiration for Auguste Rodin. We did the Thinker. But no, the statue of the figure, like this, basically pinched off that. Okay, inspired from that. Okay, but then he also, he considered himself primarily a sculptor, but in about 1508 he was asked to paint the Sistine Chapel by Pope Julius II, and he had to reinvent the art of fresco painting in order to do it, because the techniques that were available to him up until that stage were not enough. He wanted to do extra stuff, so he actually reinvented fresco painting, which is a whole story unto itself, and he painted the Sistine ceiling between the years of 1508 and I think 1512. It took him 4 years to paint it. Now have a look at these figures. I mentioned before that they're heroic. What do I mean by heroic? If I say the term heroic, a figure's heroic, what do I mean by that term?
Larger than life.
Larger than life, yeah. In what ways could somebody be larger than life? It's a heroic figure. Or what ways? Their gesture, yeah, how they move, it's very theatrical, yeah. They're very imposing physically. Remember, he was a sculptor. And so I think sculptors have this thing about the human body. If they're going to make it, they have to physically make it. It's a mass. It's different to painting something. You understand it in terms of mass and solidity and structure. Yeah? So his figures in his paintings have all this heroic attitude. They've got these incredible sort of exaggerated poses, very dramatic. And this lent itself really well to the Mannerist style. Actually evolved into the Mannerist style. This sort of thing. Look at this figure here, in particular, yeah. Because we're going to, in the next slide, I think, we've got a series of drawings. Now the top three are drawings by Michelangelo. Here we have a study for the Adam, the figure of Adam with his hand, receiving the power from God. Okay, life from God. Here we've got, and this is for the Sistine ceiling. These other two drawings, they're for studies for the Last Judgment, which is on the far wall. Now, this part of this work in the Sistine Chapel was painted in the 1540s, so they're like 30 years apart. He did this in between 1508 and 1512, and in 1540 he got commissioned to paint this by a different Pope Leo X, I think it was. In between this period, he did produce sculptures as well. The important thing to realise that during this time, why is this important in particular? It's because they were building St. Peter's. Now St. Peter's, where St. Peter's is today, everybody been to Rome, you've seen St. Peter's, yeah? That was designed by Michelangelo. Sorry, not designed, but by Bramante, who was an architect. And later on, Michelangelo took over the project. And after Raphael took it over for a period, then Michelangelo took it over. It was a project which lasted like 60 years or something, some enormous amount of period of time to build it all. Actually, it extended further than that because it wasn't finished up until 17 something or other. I can't remember what it is, but it lasted a long time to be finished the way it is today. And because they were building St. Peter's, the Sistine Chapel, which was an older chapel, became the main centre where people would come and listen to the Pope say Mass. Now it's a little side chapel. It's not part of the main church, but for a while it was. And so imagine, people would go to Mass to hear the Pope. He would hold Mass in his private chapel, which is the Sistine Chapel, which is attached to the papal apartments behind it. And you would be forced to see all this stuff. And imagine for people who were born, who lived basically in a society where they couldn't read, and you only saw pictures, you thought, gee, he made those things, they were incredible. This was really astounding, a really astounding thing. And so, of course, his fame grew, Michelangelo's fame grew through that way. And Tintoretto learned a lot from looking at those figures. So the top three are Michelangelo's, and the bottom three are Tintoretto's. Oops, sorry. This figure here, remember that figure I asked you to look at in the ceiling? Okay, there it is. Now he didn't go there. He probably got it from a copy of a drawing of a cast by someone else or a print that was sent up there. Okay? Look at this figure. This figure is this. So you can see that he actually was drawing directly from the source. Alright? And then I want to talk about this, right? I want to talk about this one, this figure, because this will be very evident when that appears next. But can you see the connection that's going on there? Alright? The work that's going on. So this is like this is how culture's passed down. From artist to artist, word of mouth, picture to picture. Okay? It's just organic, these things occur. Alright, so let's go to his first commission. Okay, Tintoretto and the Scuola Grande di San Marco. Now, as Maria said earlier, the confraternities were really powerful organisations. They were there for beneficial works. They had a lot of rich donors who would contribute to the building of the buildings and commission works for it. And in 1548, he managed to get, Tintoretto managed to make contact with someone who was on the board of this very important little company, and through their friendship he managed to get his first commission, which was the Miracle of the Slave. Now this looks like a fairly normal sized painting until you realise that it's 4.15 metres by 5.1. It's about the size of the wall, back wall. It's a bit wider than the big wall at the back there. The whole thing and the height. So it's pretty massive, which makes each figure life size. You can imagine it in front of you. You can stand in front of that and be probably as tall as this figure here at the front. What's this painting about? This painting is primarily about, it's a legend that evolved around St. Mark. Remember, this was done for the confraternity of St. Mark, so of course they're going to venerate the saint. And the legend goes that a certain wealthy lord or merchant, being this guy here, sends one of his slaves, which is this guy here, to Venice to do an errand for him. And he's a pagan, he's not Christian, but he sends his servant or his slave to do an errand for him, and while he's there, his slave, because he was Christian, he goes to the church of St. Mark, and he goes there to venerate the remains of St. Mark. When he gets back home, his boss finds out that he didn't do what he was asked to do, and he wasted time doing this other thing, and decided to make an example of him. So he wanted to have him tortured, as you do with your slave. You don't do what you're told. And so he employed 3 people. There's this guy here holding a stick, this guy holding a hammer, and there's a broken axe on the ground, and there's another guy, and this axe probably belonged to him before. What's happened is they're going to torture him, and they're going to poke out his eye, cut off his feet, and smash his mouth, so he couldn't venerate, he couldn't pray anymore. Right? But as soon as he did that, as soon as they tried to do that, because this person had so much faith, St. Mark comes in like Superman here, sweeping down from the heavens, faster than a speeding bullet, and destroys the implements of torture in their hands. Okay, so interesting story, full of energy, very far-fetched, but you can see the way he's animated the whole scene. And this is really new. This is a new thing. This sort of convention of having these figures all bunched up. You look at them, they're really well observed. They're sort of observed from life. And you look at each person, each figure has got his own reaction to these things. Let's have a look at them close up. And looking at them close up, you can start to see why his technique, for the time, was quite shocking. Now, this image doesn't do the picture justice, but you see all this brushwork. You can almost hear it. It's done very quickly. You can almost hear the paint across the surface. He's got people here in turbans. Why turbans? What do we know about St. Mark? Where was he from? Where was St. Mark from? Egypt, right? So the pagans, yeah? We've got people in contemporary gear. So this armour would have been contemporary to the time of Tintoretto. So it's just this thing is actually, this was a usual thing you saw in the Renaissance. They would paint the religious scene that happened 1,000 years prior in what was then modern garb. It was like updating the story so people could connect with it. You look at the faces of these people, all peering over, each having a discussion. There's different people doing different things. Look at the reaction, the stunned reaction of his master when the weapons break. Yeah? When these implements of torture break in their hands on their own. They don't know what's going on. And here's the body of the slave, and this is said to be a self-portrait of Tintoretto. He's included himself, like Alfred Hitchcock used to do it, put himself in the painting, say, hey, it's me, I did it. Right? That's him. Right? Now, what is so strange about this painting? Oh, first of all, one last thing. Look at this character here. That's pretty weird, isn't it, when you think about it? Half in, half out of a canvas. What does the inclusion of this figure do to the scene?
The observer.
He's an observer. He's like you and me.
Yes.
He's sitting just outside the frame. This figure is actually one of the people who helped him get the job and helped him get some other jobs. This guy was called Tommaso Ragnolo, I think he was. And he was a major patron. And he was included in the painting, and you'll see him pop up later in other paintings because he was a really important sort of character. He wanted to be included in the painting because he wanted to be associated with St. Mark and the whole thing, right? But look at it. Really, look at the how this is framed. You've got these figures which half appear, they sort of disappear off the edge. Look at this figure here from the back, very Michelangelesque. You know, this turned figure like this. You know, really dramatic pose. But nobody's noticing. Everybody's not worried about the slave and these things breaking, but nobody notices St. Mark. Now, this is a common theme in the way Tintoretto tells a story. This is there to remind us that miracles happen. And there's this other dimension that exists at the same time as we do. But because we're so preoccupied with our own troubles, we don't give the other world any thought. Even though it's there, it exists, it's there, it's solid. But we don't see it, we don't recognise it as such because we don't have faith. Okay, so remember, he was a highly religious sort of character. And so there's a spiritual message in this, which is not commonly seen in the work of the High Renaissance, for instance. Because in the High Renaissance, if you had a saint, everybody would know the saint. You'd see people praying in front of the saint. The saint would be there. But here, he's present and he's not. He's present and he's not. Okay, Maria spoke about the plague earlier. Around this time, a year later, okay, 1549, he gets an introduction for the first time to the confraternity of San Rocco, and they needed some pictures painted to go to be associated with the church of San Rocco, not the main confraternity hall, but the church, because it wasn't finished by that stage. And so he decided to show scenes from the life of San Rocco. This is just one of the paintings. Now, during his life, Tintoretto painted 295 canvases. Now, that's a lot of paintings, but it's not really that much compared to, say, Picasso, who painted 16,000. But when you see the scale of his work, then you see how much painting he really did. Because this is not small. This is 3 metres by 6 metres, 6.5 metres, almost 7 metres long. So imagine, and most of this was painted by him. And the thing about Venetian painting that distinguishes it from Florentine painting is that their main material to work with was canvas, which is a really modern thing. Everyone paints on canvas now. But up until this period, it was common for people to paint on wood panels, like the Mona Lisa's on a wooden panel, for instance, or fresco. Canvas, still appeared in Venice and etc. But in Florence, etc. But in Venice, it played a very particular role. Why canvas in Venice, you reckon? What did that take off as a material?
Sharp off, of course.
Sorry?
Sharp off, yeah, because they're producing. They were big manufacturers of ships in those days.
Yes, sails and ships, yeah, for sure. They had plenty of canvas.
There was no timber.
Sorry?
There was no timber.
Well, the canvas is stretched on timber.
Yes, but there was no timber to paint as a panel.
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
The real reason is it's a very humid environment, right? Now, if you painting on wooden panels, yeah, you can do that, but it's heavy and you've got to move it around and you've got to get the wood. It's expensive, yeah. As was mentioned earlier, there was a ship building manufacturing industry there, and they would make sails. Now, canvas became the natural material to paint on because it's light. You can roll it up, you can stretch it, you can sew it together to make bigger canvases. And so many of these are painted, you can see seams. See the seam? They were made of multi-sheets that were sewn together, okay, to make the thing. So I'll work very quickly through this, and you can see the love he has of the human figure. This is like a way to show off, I know how to paint. He was 31. 31 years old, he was doing stuff like this, absolutely amazing. And it's like the figures in foreshortened perspective. It's really difficult to do and even to think about. Each one's doing something else. And you see some Rocco here, looking through, trying to cure somebody of his malady, showing him his leg. It's a very natural thing. This guy's got a sore on him. But what's the painting really about? The painting, you'll always see in a Tintoretto painting, the way he tells the story is not what it seems. If you look very closely to the centre of the action, you think that it's about some rock. Yes, it is, but really it's about this. Death. Yeah? Death. That's really what it's about. It's about how this is able to stop this. All the rest is framing. Can you understand that? It's a way to communicate this. And we see that in the way, the narrative structure of his paintings. There's a nice detail. We'll move forward quickly. There's that one. Okay. A little while later, 1552, about 62, he manages to get some work in the Madonna dell'Orto in Venice. One little church in which he's buried, I think. Okay. Over a 10-year period, Tintoretto produced a number of important works for this church, which included a Last Judgment, a Last Judgment from the Book of St. John, a Crucifixion, another major subject for religious artists at the time, and a thing called the Presentation of the Virgin. Now, this story of the Presentation of the Virgin is not a standard story you find in the Bible. It's something that's inferred, and it was a legend that came afterwards. But it's about the life of the Virgin Mary. Okay, because we really don't know much about Mary through the Gospels themselves. We don't know much about her early life, etc., other than those main events which occurred, like the Annunciation and things of that nature. So the Presentation of the Virgin was one of a series of different stories which tried to, like the backstory to Mary, which were popular at the time. And so these are the three paintings. Last Judgment, there it is. That's 8 metres tall. That's about 8 metres tall. A Crucifixion, nice big painting there as well, that's huge. And then this painting here, the smallest painting, is called the Presentation of the Virgin. And that shows Virgin Mary here being presented to the high priest of the temple. Okay? Let's have a look at which one. We're going to do this. We're going to look at this one. We can't look at all of them. I'll have to run through them. Okay, again, look at the size. 4.2 metres by 4.8 metres. Huge! That's the smallest painting. So imagine the energy this man had. Imagine the size of his brushes. It was huge. Right? But it's really interesting, yeah? Look, really interesting way. Now this to us looks okay, we look at it, we sort of appreciate it, but we don't really see what it meant for the people at the time. This subject was painted by other people. Most notably, Titian, his teacher. And his teacher's take on the same story is like this. It's still a very large painting, isn't it? Have a look at the doors underneath, here and here. It sort of give you the idea of the scale of this mural. Again, we have Mary being presented. There's a set of stairs. There's a lot of things in common. Here's Tintoretto's version, and here's this version. What's the difference?
Colour, the tone.
The colour tone. What else?
Perspective.
Sorry?
Perspective.
Yeah, what about the perspective?
Least front on and that's on the side.
Yeah, that's right. He's front on and the other guy's from the side, yeah? Sorry. There you go. Look at this character. Peeking from the side again. He's introducing us, he's putting us in the position of someone who has to climb these stairs. He's telling us he's focusing on the trip, the journey. Sorry. Titian shows us what the event was about. Yeah? Whereas Titian sucks us into the painting through the design. You almost want to climb those stairs. That's why imagine this thing's being big. It's huge. So the stairs, everything's life size again, and you feel like you want to climb the stairs and fold them up there. Okay? There's a strong diagonal, there's a strong asymmetry in the painting. Yeah? Fantastic stuff. I won't go into it any further, but just keep in mind that how Tintoretto tells the story is really different to artists that preceded that time. Now here's two subjects. St. George and the Dragon. Everybody knows about St. George and the Dragon. St. George was a Syrian saint, I think he was, or Turkish saint, I'm not sure. But the legend goes that he saved a maiden from a dragon, who witnessed the devil, on horseback, and he saved it. Whatever. This, on the right, is Raphael's version of that story. early part of the 15th century, 16th century. Okay, high Renaissance. We see St. George in the forefront, the most important thing, the dragon being killed, and we see the maid in the background. We could pray back there that everything turns out okay in the end. And this is very conventional in many ways. St. George is the main focus. What does Titian do? He turns that on its head. He shows the action back here. The action is always in the background, right? And he makes you part of it by putting you in the role of this figure, the figure being saved. So you see how the story is not linear left to right, like in the Titian painting, but it's into the canvas. The further back you look into the canvas, the more likely for you to know what's there, what the story is actually about. I'll rush through these. Okay, move to the next one. Here we go into the Scuola Grande di San Marco. And we see something similar happening here. This story is about the discovery of the tomb of St. Mark. They stole the body of St. Mark from a tomb, and they pinched it from Alexandria, and they took it to Venice. This is the story that's meant to show that. And if we use the same logic as we used in the previous slide, you start to see really what the painting is about. We've got an ossuary here, or where they keep the dead bodies, and these chests, and in the tombs, underneath the ground, and then at the front we've got these figures. Now, who are they? Look at this. This is the discovery. Here we see St. Mark at the whole story being told in one frame. The discovery of his tomb, his dead body, and St. Mark here. St. Mark appears actually, is referenced 3 times. Here he's gesturing to these figures here who are opening up coffins at random trying to find his body. So he's saying, stop! Sorry. He's saying, stop. I'm here. Here I am. There's no need. But look back here. Look at this. This is an amazing detail. There's people looking into a tomb in the ground. But there's light emanating from it. If you look up close, you're able to see that. There's a flame. There's a man holding a torch, looking down, peering down into this hole. And so we get this whole idea of light having taken a symbolic meaning. That's where the body of the saint is. That's where it was. This is where it is. But he's not dead really, because he's here. And look who pops up. Tommaso Ragnone. Here it is. Holding his hand out, gesturing in a protective gesture with the dead body of the thing, because he's the main patron. And here we've got a couple of people who are possessed by a demon who he later exorcises, gets rid of. So there's a whole story in this little thing. But look at the dramatic perspective. Think of, here's another perspective, yeah? This is the stealing of his body from Alexandria. Now, St. Mark's body was stolen, they say, in I think it's the 6th century. But, St. Mark was martyred, I think, in the 6th century. And the story goes like this. He was killed they put a noose around his neck and they dragged him through the cities of Alexandria, the streets of Alexandria, until he was dead. Then they tried to set his body on fire. But before they could do that, a storm broke out and it started to hail. And if you look back here, there's you can't really see that well, there's a thunderbolt which indicates that. As soon as that happened, his followers came and took the body and whisked it away to safety and entombed it. Does that make sense? This happened in the 6th century. But what they did here is they converted this to the stealing of the body from Alexandria to Venice. So they moved it forward in time. And so we have this really dramatic colonnade, which is actually, if you go to Venice, this is taken from the Piazza di San Marco. Over here there's a Versace and a Prada shop just here, you know about those. That's just behind in this little corner, but that's where it is. This is only a section of the painting. The painting itself was cut and edited. This is an earlier drawing of what the painting actually looked like, and you can see that it had more figures, and we'll see something about these in a moment. But we've got these figures here running away, we'll see them here. But there's also this figure here floating up in the sky, which is the spirit. We don't see that here because this was damaged, and at different times it was recut to fit a new frame. Anyway, interesting little thing. And he arrived at San Rocco, 1564 to 1588. Interesting story behind this. Sorry if I'm taking your time, but I've got to get through this really quickly. I said about how competitive he was and what a savvy businessman he was. The story of the San Rocco story is really interesting. It's quite funny, really. The story goes like this: that the confraternity put out tender to the artists who were going to present some designs to be accepted for the decoration of San Rocco. It was newly built, so they wanted to get artists in to see who could do the job. Put out the tender, and so they asked them all to present a sketch of their design, and they were going to be assessed in front of everyone else. So at a big meeting, and so what Tintoretto did was he heard about this tender process, so he organised not to do a sketch but to do a full painting. And he had a friend of his who was a co-conspirator with him install the painting in the ceiling. Right? This is before the meeting. Right? Now, this roundel is in a really prominent part of the main hall. It's right in the centre. So he got this installed, and on the day, all the artists showed up. There was Veronese, Giorgione, all these big names. They all showed up with their little sketches. And the judges said, here you go, this is my idea. Finally gets around to Tintoretto and says, where's your sketch, Master Tintoretto? And he said, he pointed up, and at that point, his assistant pulled the string, and this thing dropped, this sheet dropped, and there was San Rocco. Now, he also knew that if you donated something to the confraternity, that they couldn't refuse it. If it was done, they could not refuse it. It was in the rules. So he said, I donate this to you. Well, suddenly, what do you have? You got all these people arguing. That's not fair, that's mine, no, you can't do that. I'm not going to have my painting with his painting in the middle of the room. They started to argue amongst each other, and they left. Who was left standing? He was. He got the commission. Not only that, to make sure that nobody else could work in there, he managed to negotiate with them a payment of 100 ducats a year, which was a significant amount of money, and he would finish the job for however long it took, and there was no limitation on what he could do. And so they were locked out of this thing, which is an amazing thing. But that's just to say what kind of negotiator he was, and what a terrible man he really was. He could have been if he were going to compete. Okay, so there is up there, and as you walk in, directly facing that is the crucifixion. Now we haven't got time to go into detail on the crucifixion, but I will show you its scale. Okay, so Tintoretto produced over 60 major works over a 20-year period for the Schola di San Rocco, depicting various scenes from the Old and New Testaments, scenes of the life of San Rocco, and of course the crucifixion. Now this crucifixion is enormous. 5.3 metres by 11.27 metres. That's enormous, that's huge. It's like the length of this gallery space, even bigger. Right? And huge, right? Amazing. He also produced this work, okay? The Brazen Serpent. This is a story from the Old Testament, and it goes something like this: that when the Israelites were in the desert, they were afflicted by serpents, which God sent to them to punish them because they'd been very bad, the golden calf and all the rest. And they asked Moses for help, and God said to Moses, make a statue of a bronze serpent and show it to them, and say that your Lord thy God has ordered you to do this, and they'll be cured. So he created this bronze serpent, and they're all saved, sort of thing. They got their faith back. But this is, I'm showing you this to show the relevance to Michelangelo. And if you look at this is God here, being supported by angels. Yeah? And this is Michelangelo's take in the Sistine Chapel. They're almost identical, you could say, just that he's got hair, and he hasn't. So there's God there, and this is something that we can see constantly, constant references to Michelangelo throughout the work. We'll get to the Palazzo Ducale. We'll skip through this quickly, but I want to show you one last big painting. Il Paradiso. This is the biggest painting on canvas during the Renaissance. This is absolutely enormous. It's 22 metres by 7 metres. 22 metres by 7 metres. That's absolutely enormous. And this was painted by him, and his son assisted him, obviously. And this is in the Ducal Palace. It represents paradise. It's immediately over where the council would meet. to show them to give them an idea of what the perfect hierarchy should be in the world. Yeah. We saw this in Venice when we went a couple of years ago. It was absolutely stunning work. It's beautiful work. Okay. Show you some quick works. San Giorgio Maggiore, final works. The Last Supper. Now you've all seen Leonardo's Last Supper. Those Dan Brown fans have seen the Last Supper. And how's the Last Supper shown? Usually front on, isn't it? Yeah. There he is. There's Leonardo. Now that's a very common way. After Leonardo painted that, it's become a very common way to represent the Last Supper because it's an illustration of what occurred. You can see perspective. These are perspective lines, all converging on Christ's right eye. You see all the apostles there. No one's got a halo. Michael, remember, High Renaissance, they were looking at a rational world, a rational description of the world. So the halo disappeared for a while until this. Let's have a look at it close up. The whole perspective of this is askew, on a diagonal, isn't it? It's not in front. So it's got more, automatically it's more energetic. This was designed to be high up on a wall, so you walk in and you see it from this angle. So that's the main way you'd see it, you'd make sense of it. And you look at the light source. Where is light coming from in this painting? Where's light coming from? It's coming from the figure of Christ. He's got this halo. He's actually the light is so strong that it's casting this strong light on this figure and across the room, but it's also coming from this lamp, which is billowing flames and smoke, and the smoke is actually angels. So he's actually set the whole Last Supper scene inside this this world with this other dimension. It's almost like the screen's been torn from this other dimension, and we get to see this otherworldly sort of existence. Okay, and he's mixed this up with normal, like he's having a meal here in a normal banquet hall. Heretical, you think about it. Reformation, yeah. It's heretical almost. It's not a holy place. These people are doing all types of things here. Yeah, people offering food. There's a cat looking inside a basket here for food. Okay, all these little details which you don't see immediately. And then you've got the apostles all emanating light, except for Judas. Okay? So again, he's telling us something about that. So you can see how the perspective changes. How he's played with that perspective. This is revolutionary in its time. Compared to the Leonardo, it's a very, very different spirit in that painting. It's mannerist. Yeah, this later led to really exuberant work that was produced in the Baroque by other artists. But we get to see that later on. Okay, and here we go to the very last painting that he had anything to do with. This was mainly finished, this painting here, this deposition was painted in his final days, his final months, before he died. It was finished by his son. I've included that picture to show you the scale of that work. This is probably the smallest thing he's ever painted. Okay? Everything else is like 5 metres, 10 metres, 20 metres, whatever. Yeah? But this is like a small intimate thing for a small chapel in San Gregorio. Again, the story being told, the squash space, the ambiguous sort of the relationship of one object to another, all crammed into this particular painting. And quite coincidentally, this subject was the very last subject that his teacher Titian worked on before he died also. So it was a deposition, like Christ down from the cross, sort of this poetic ring to it. His teacher Titian also experienced the same. So, Tintoretto's legacy, okay? He left a huge legacy after his death, okay? Innovative brushwork, he's sort of liberated the brush from the form. So that's really the beginnings of this sort of thing, abstraction. Think about it. This spirit of what is in these pictures here starts there. When you free the brush stroke from the subject, and suddenly the brush exists on its own, the mark exists on its own. Okay? Compositional techniques and technical bravura were adopted by successive artists beyond the confines of it. But most notably, firstly, by El Greco, which we spoke about earlier, okay, who introduced his work to Spain, and through El Greco, Velázquez one of the greatest painters of all time, took that on, and then later on in the Romantic period, in the 1850s onwards, in France, you started to have artists like Géricault and Delacroix, the period of the Revolution, French Revolution. She started to produce work which later came to be known as romantic art, or emotionally charged work. And you can see how this sort of work sort of got its impetus. Okay. Some scholars are also saying that Tintoretto's work exists also in the work of Giorgio di Chirico. And I don't know if you know di Chirico. He's a metaphysical painter, modern Italian artist. You know, worked in the 30s and 40s. Really beautiful work. But he did this whole thing with deep perspective. You sort of echo some of Tintoretto's earlier paintings. And the same can be said for details in Salvador Dali's work. Some people say that some of the brushwork and some of the figures in the background of Salvador Dali's work were, if not lifted, inspired by what Tintoretto had done. So his work was enormous. Okay, that's about it. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry to go over time. I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, again, I apologise for going over time. Thank you for dealing with this. You've been very patient, very good with us. Thank you for that. It can be stressful when the technology works against you, conspires against you. But I hope you learned something there. Remember that we run these sort of talks every couple of months. Keep your eye out for these when the notifications that come out. The next one will be on Caravaggio. The one after that will be on the Baroque and Bernini. And then we're going to move into the 20th century. We're going to move forward into the 20th century, and we're going to look at art movements and how they evolved through time. Okay? Thanks again. God bless. Take care. And look at Tintoretto in a different way. A genius of an artist. I love him. I think he's fantastic, and I think you should. Okay. Thanks very much. I'll take it. Oh, the tour for Italy. It's in Maria. She's got all the details from Maria. Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you.